All right, so is the microphone on? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm good. So I'm going to talk about taking a strategic approach to assessing the viability of open source projects. A quick thank you to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for funding the Chaos Data Science Initiative, which pays my bills, along with the Linux Foundation and the Ford Foundation, who also provide support for Chaos. I'll start by telling you just a teeny bit about me. So I've been in the technology industry for well over 20 years, working mostly on open source projects from within companies like Puppet, Intel, VMware. I'm currently working on data science for the Chaos project, where I'm also a governing board member and maintainer. I'm a board member of OpenUK. I'm co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group, and I also have a PhD where I researched how people collaborate within the Linux kernel. And I also spend a lot of time thinking about open source project sustainability and viability. So, obligatory XKCD comic. As you know, this scenario is way too common. One of the biggest examples of this was Heartbleed, when we learned that OpenSSL had really no resources to maintain that software that all of us used. And there are hundreds of thousands of other open source projects that are in a similar situation. Evaluating project viability and the risk that comes with it is important because it really can disrupt your business. It's also important to think about viability and risk as being on a continuum. Like with most things in life, there are no sure bets, right? There's no project or technology, open source or not, that is completely without risk. And there are only projects that are more or less viable across a variety of categories. And whether you should embrace a project and accept that risk depends on a business decision, right? And a strategic decision that should also take how you're actually using that project into account. So looking at the viability of projects, especially ones that have the potential to impact your business, is a good first step toward managing risk and reducing the chances of potential disruptions. It's particularly important to look at the viability of any open source projects that are critical for your ability to deliver products to your customers, or in the case of a project, to your users. This could include products that are built on top of an open source technology, or where those open source projects are integrated into your products or into your infrastructure. If you could not easily swap that project or technology out with a drop-in replacement for something similar, you really should be assessing the viability of that project and understanding the risks that come with it. This talk will compare projects under neutral foundations versus those controlled by companies, and look at how people leading and contributing to the project can influence viability. I'll talk about some details about how to assess viability across 4 broad areas: governance, compliance and security, strategy, and community, which all impact the stability and overall viability of a project. And throughout these areas, I'll talk about techniques for measurement and some collections of metrics that can be used in your evaluations. I wanted to start by talking about why it's important to think about who owns or controls an open source project, because it's something that many of us really don't spend as much time thinking about as we should. The project's governance documents can help you learn a little bit more about the ownership and control of a project. And from a risk and a strategic perspective, you really should be looking for projects with neutral governance, where decisions are made by people from a variety of different companies. Projects that are controlled by foundations and ones that are owned by an individual company have very different dynamics and different risks associated with using and contributing to those projects. So I'll start with a couple of examples of what can happen with projects that don't have neutral governance. Licensing changes, yay. These are one thing that can increase our business risk, especially when an open source project is controlled by a single company. There have been several companies who were a little fed up with cloud providers selling software as a service offerings based on their open source projects without really giving much back to the development. So their solution was to use more restrictive non-open source licenses, so in this case the SSPL, and situations like this one increase your business risk. And when you're building your product strategies, you should be thinking about whether this is a risk for the projects you're using or incorporating into your products. New restrictions on how we use an open source project could delay product delivery and decrease productivity if we need to spend extra time finding and implementing a suitable replacement. One way we can avoid situations like what I just talked about is by supporting projects that are under neutral foundations whenever possible. CNCF, Linux Foundation, Apache, Eclipse, these are all neutral foundations. However, it's not always clear whether a foundation is neutral or not. If the board of directors or other leadership bodies are made up of people who work for a wide range of companies, especially competing companies, that's a good indication that it's a neutral foundation. If the board members are made up primarily of people from a single company or a couple of companies with very close ties and then a token board member or two, it's not likely to be a neutral foundation. It can also help to look at the projects under that foundation. Were they originated by a single company, or did they come from a whole bunch of different companies? Do the projects have leaders from a variety of companies? And so the more you see references to a single company across the projects within that foundation, the less likely it is to be neutral. One of the reasons Kubernetes has been so incredibly successful is because Google contributed it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right? Putting Kubernetes into a neutral foundation provided a level playing field where people from a whole bunch of different companies could work together as equals to create something that benefits all of us and the entire ecosystem. Open source projects that are controlled by a single company are higher risk, and they can be less viable over the long term because they operate at the whims of that company. And there's very little recourse for outside contributors or users when that company decides to go in a direction that doesn't align with the expectations of the other participants within the community. Think back to the examples from earlier. For company-originated open source projects, consider the reputation of that company as a steward of open source projects. But always keep in mind that they can change their strategy at some later date, right? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't use or contribute to projects that are owned by companies, but you should think about the risks you're taking and whether that project is likely to be viable over the long term. In some cases, it totally makes a ton of sense to accept that higher risk. But you should try to at least make sure that you understand the risks you're taking and how those risks might impact your company and your strategies. Along with the ownership of a project, there are quite a few different areas that you should look at as part of your viability assessment for a project, including governance, community, security and compliance, and strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, this is particularly important if a project is critical to your ability to deliver products to your customers and couldn't easily be just substituted with something similar. Within the Chaos project, we have something called metrics models, which are collections of metrics that are intended to be used together. Because measuring project viability is a fairly complex task, we actually have 4 metrics models devoted to viability, and these were created by Gary White from Verizon, who's awesome. And each of those is focused on a different viability topic, and I'll cover all 4 of those viability models and talk about them in more detail about the metrics that you can use within those models to measure each area. So the second link at the bottom of the slide is to a 3-part blog post series that Gary wrote to help people understand these 4 models and how to use them. So I encourage you to have a look at those blog posts. And the slides are already uploaded on Sketch, so you should be able to grab the link from there as well. Governance can be found in all open source projects in one form or another, and it helps outline the expectations around roles and responsibilities, along with decision-making processes. But it'll vary quite a bit by the size of the project. Knowing how collaboration occurs and how decisions are made is vital to building a sustainable open source project, because it means that people are able to make contributions and are more likely to be accepted. If the processes for collaboration, leadership, and decision-making are not clearly documented as part of the project governance, this can increase the risk of participating in or using the project because it just introduces a lot of uncertainty into the mix. Leadership is a critical piece of governance. This is my favorite picture. This is Paris showing leadership right there. There might be committees, working groups, special interest groups, or other groups who help lead various aspects of the project. At a minimum, there should be some kind of documentation about leadership within a project, including who those leaders are and how they're selected. Ideally, there should be a fair and transparent process for selecting leaders, with leadership seats held by individuals with the right expertise and enough time available to actually lead the project. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have a viability metrics model for governance that's designed to look at several areas to see if the project is well governed and that the maintainers and project leaders are taking good care of the project. These metrics look at things like issue inclusivity, which looks at whether issues are well labeled to make it easier for people to find something to work on. Responsiveness metrics like time to close, change request closure ratio, and issue age determine if the maintainers are keeping up with contributions and actually responding to them in a timely manner. Lib years and release frequency indicate whether maintainers are keeping up with or keeping their dependencies up to date and making sure that updates and fixes actually land in a release in a timely fashion. But in addition to the metrics, it's always a good idea to have someone actually read through the governance documents to look for any red flags, especially for projects that are critical for your products. A few common red flags might include a lack of a process for removing leaders or maintainers who maybe aren't acting in the best interest of the project, project leadership seats allocated to organizations instead of individuals, and unclear processes for selecting leaders, just to name a few. The community is a critical part of assessing the viability of an open source project. Is the community active and engaged in productive discussions around the project? Are they helpful when people have questions or problems? Are they welcoming for new contributors and new users? Do they treat each other with kindness and respect? You'll want to look carefully at how people treat each other in discussions, GitHub reviews, Slack, and whatever other communication channels they have. Projects with a culture of treating each other with respect and kindness are going to be more viable because people will want to continue to contribute. On the other hand, projects with toxic cultures put community members at risk. There could be real health risks, both mental and physical, and these toxic environments can impact retention for your employees who contribute because they might be so eager to leave that project that they'll look for another company to work for who isn't going to make them work in that kind of environment. And if the culture is too toxic, there's a real chance that the project could stagnate or even just cease to exist if too many people leave, which could result in that project then becoming unviable. And I'll talk in a minute about some community metrics that can indicate whether a community is healthy, but it's still a good idea, again, to go beyond the metrics and have someone look at the community communication channels to answer some of those questions that I just mentioned. There are so many abandoned open source projects just sprinkled all across the internet, and there is no single reason that projects are abandoned. Technologies evolve, people change priorities, maybe the community just loses interest. But one thing that can reduce the risk of embracing an open source project is if the project is adopted by a bunch of other companies and a bunch of other people, since active projects with plenty of users are going to be less likely to be abandoned. Having a strong user base reduces the risk that the project might be abandoned. If you're actively using an open source project, it's likely you'll find bugs or want to contribute fixes back upstream. So for new projects you're considering using, you'll want to make sure that the maintainers and other contributors typically respond in a timely fashion. Seeing large numbers of issues and pull requests on a project is a red flag for me because it can indicate that they either don't have enough contributors to handle incoming contributions, or even worse, that they don't actually care about or want contributions from other people, which you do actually see in some company-owned open source projects. Open source projects that are designed to keep diversity, equity, and inclusion top of mind will be more likely to be viable over the long term. Having a code of conduct that's actively enforced helps make sure that everyone feels safe and welcome within the community. Providing an environment where everyone, especially people from marginalized populations, feel safe is an important measure of viability, or important indicator of viability. You should look at whether the project has a diverse set of people at every level within the project, but especially in leadership positions. Projects that make a concerted effort to bring in new people from a variety of backgrounds and have programs in place to help them grow into leadership positions are more likely to be viable, benefit from increased innovation, and just have a healthier community overall. And this increased innovation from a diverse community is particularly important from a strategic perspective for the companies who use these projects. Now, diversity and inclusion can be difficult to measure, and to be honest, it often involves a manual assessment or other techniques like surveys, for example. So this isn't included directly in the metrics model that I'll talk about next, but we have defined some metrics within the CHAOS Project's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group that you can have a look at for how to measure a project's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, one thing you'll notice is that some metrics actually do appear in multiple models. For example, change request closure ratio is a responsiveness metric that isn't just related to governance and maintainers, as I talked about earlier, but also relates strongly to the viability of the community as a whole. Metrics like clones, forks, and other project popularity metrics don't actually tell you anything about the health of the project, but they can indicate that there's an interest in using and contributing to the project. And projects with good adoption and an active community can be an indicator of viability, especially if those metrics are growing over time. Types of contributions is a particularly important type of metric for viability. Change requests, committers are a good start, but you should also look for a wide range of contributions happening beyond just code. So this is harder to measure, but things like documentation, community accessibility, and more can show that you have a well-rounded community of people working on all aspects of the project beyond the code, which also improves viability. Now, people often worry about security for open source projects. If everyone can see the code, they might find and exploit security vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, there are also more people who can fix those security vulnerabilities. Now, this doesn't mean that open source projects are automatically secure. Nothing is. One thing to look for when assessing the viability of open source projects is whether they make regular releases and quickly patch security vulnerabilities. You should also, and again, there isn't a metric for this, but you should look at the project's security policy documents and make sure that they actually have a good process for allowing anyone to privately report security vulnerabilities, and a process for notifying companies who use their projects so that they can fix them in advance of it becoming public. So in short, projects that take a proactive approach to addressing security issues and fixing them will be more viable over the long term. One good way to evaluate the security of an open source project is with the OpenSSF scorecard, which is great, has a wealth of information about the security of a project beyond just the score, so don't just look at the score. Other metrics, defect resolution duration, lib years, other dependency measures are also important because projects that are slow to fix vulnerabilities and update dependencies will be less secure, which makes them a less viable solution because you don't want to ship products to your customers that have crappy security. License compliance is also critical, and that is one of the things that can make or break your ability to actually use an open source project and include it in your products. We don't always spend enough time thinking about contributor risk with many open source projects. For the open source projects that we rely on, are there enough contributors that if one of them won the lottery and retired on a beach, would the project continue with minimal disruptions? You should also look at organizational diversity. If all or most of the contributions come from the employees at a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy or gets acquired or just runs out of money and goes out of business and disappears entirely? Would the project be able to continue? So these single vendor open source projects might not seem risky, but they can quickly become unviable if everyone stops working on the project. So we have bus factor, sometimes called the lottery factor, which looks at contributor risk. We have elephant factor, which is a similar metric, but for organizations, which can give you a sense for how many organizations are involved in the project, along with organizational influence. If these numbers are high and you've got loads of people and loads of organizations contributing, it's more likely to be viable over the long term. Programming language can also be a concern, so especially for smaller organizations, if your employees are mostly familiar with Python, then a project written in Java might be very difficult for them to manage and contribute to if they find a bug. So projects and languages that your employees know well might be more viable for you to use. Now, most business decisions boil down to an assessment of risk and making trade-offs. We should all be thinking strategically about project risks in light of how we're using the projects within our business. If we build products on top of an open source technology, we want it to be as low of a risk as possible. On the other hand, if we're using an open source project as some small part of some non-critical infrastructure, then we can accept more risk. And throughout this presentation, I talked about how to assess viability and how often it comes down to thinking about it from the perspective of risk and which risks you should accept. But it's also important to think about which risks you might be able to mitigate. So the best way to mitigate these risks is by paying some of your employees to actually contribute to these projects. This gives you an opportunity to help out in various ways to make the project more viable overall. And it also gives you insight into where the project's heading, how things are going, and so that if something changes within the project that might increase the risk, you're more likely to know about it in advance. Here are a few resources that you might find useful. Chaos Project, we have loads of tools and metrics. Linux Foundation's To-Do Group, Open Source Way Guidebook is just one of my favorite resources about open source projects. My final thoughts. The ease in adopting open source can lead organizations to use software without actually spending any time to consider the long-term viability. Not all open source projects are created equal. Some are more viable than others in the long term. The success or failure of the open source projects you use can have real business implications. What happens when a project changes a license, stops making security updates, or has other issues that impact its usage? When a project that's incorporated into your products and services later becomes unviable, it can have huge negative implications for your users, your customers, and your reputation. It's worth spending time to critically assess whether a project is likely to be successful and will continue to meet your needs over the long term. Open source project decisions have strategic implications that should be proactively evaluated to identify risks that can be mitigated. Ultimately, whether an open source project is viable boils down to balancing the risk versus reward for your particular use case. Project viability, like most things, exists on a continuum, and we should think about project viability and make informed decisions about which projects to use. Understanding open source viability is an ongoing process, and it's a process that needs to be monitored, and decisions need to be revisited as projects evolve. With that, thank you very much.